The chandeliers above the Sterling estate threw down 1,000 points of gold light, and beneath them moved the kind of crowd that existed only to be seen. Silk, champagne, laughter that meant nothing to anyone who actually stopped to listen to it. Chloe Sterling stood near the tall windows in a dress that had cost more than most people's cars, and she watched the room the way a person watches an aquarium, aware, always, that she was on the wrong side of the glass. She was 23 years old, deaf since birth, and utterly alone in a house that never stopped making noise she couldn't hear. Two women in emerald gowns stood a few feet away, angled just enough that they clearly thought themselves out of her line of sight. They weren't. Chloe read lips the way other people read headlines, quickly, without meaning to, catching fragments she wished she hadn't. Such a shame about the daughter, one of them said, tilting her champagne glass toward Chloe without quite looking at her. Pretty girl. Pity she'll never really live a normal life. Marcus dotes on her, though. Keeps her wrapped up tight. Have you seen the security detail that follows her to the mailbox? Can you blame him? What else can a man do with a daughter like that? Chloe looked away before they could catch her noticing. It wasn't the first time she'd caught a conversation like this happening a few feet from her body, as though she were furniture with excellent posture. It wouldn't be the last. She smiled at a passing waiter, accepted a glass of sparkling water she didn't want, and let the tide of the party carry her toward the edges of the room, the way water finds the lowest point without ever trying. Her father, Marcus Sterling, stood at the center of it all, shaking hands, closing deals with his eyes before his lawyers ever opened their mouths. He was a tall man, gray at the temples, built from the same cold marble as his floors. He caught her gaze once across the room and gave her the smile he gave investors right before he asked them for something. Polished, practiced, not quite a father smile. He believed, with total and unshakable conviction, that the private tutors and the security detail and the trust fund were forms of love, the highest forms, in fact, because they cost him something. He had never once, in 23 years, sat down and asked his daughter what she actually wanted for herself, because in his mind wanting things was a luxury reserved for people who could survive without protection, and Chloe, in his eyes, could not. She slipped through a side hallway before anyone noticed she'd gone. Her heels echoed on the stone floor, though of course she couldn't hear that either. She only knew where she was by the memory of the house, by counting doors from childhood, until she reached the music room at the far end of the West Wing. It was the one place in the mansion no one used anymore. A grand piano sat under a dust cover near the window, forgotten in exactly the way she sometimes felt she was forgotten, elegant and untouched, an instrument built for a sense she didn't have. She closed the door behind her and finally let herself stop smiling. The tears came fast, the ugly kind, the kind that had been building for years rather than minutes. She sank onto the piano bench and pressed her palms against her eyes, her shoulders shaking with a silence that was, in its own strange way, its own kind of scream. She didn't notice the man in the gray staff uniform standing in the doorway with a mop and bucket until his shadow shifted across the floor in front of her. Arthur Hayes had been buffing the ballroom's marble for 6 hours already that night, his second job after a full day loading trucks at a warehouse across town, and he'd only wandered this far because a supervisor had told him to check that no drunk executive had wandered off and broken something worth more than Arthur's yearly salary. What he found instead was a young woman crying alone in a room built for music she would never hear. Most people in that house walked past Chloe when she cried. Staff had been quietly instructed, in the careful language of people who don't want to put anything in writing, to give the Sterling girl her space and not to make a scene. Arthur didn't know that rule, or maybe he simply didn't care to follow it. He set down his mop against the wall. He crossed the room slowly, giving her time to notice him, and knelt in front of the piano bench, so he was at her eye level instead of looming over her the way everyone else in her life seemed to. Chloe looked up, startled, wiping quickly at her face, embarrassed to be seen this way by a stranger in a uniform she didn't recognize. Arthur didn't say anything with his mouth. He reached out, gently, asking permission with his eyes first, and when she didn't pull away, he took her hand and laid it flat against the piano's wooden side, just below the lid. Then he reached over with his other hand and struck a low, heavy chord. The wood buzzed beneath her palm. She felt the vibration travel up through her fingers, into her wrist, humming in her bones the way distant thunder sometimes did on the rare nights she could feel a storm coming through the floor. Her eyes went wide, fixed on him. Then his hands moved again, this time in shapes she recognized instantly, shapes she hadn't seen from anyone outside a clinical office in years. "It's okay to be sad," he signed, his fingers unhurried. "I'm Arthur." Chloe stared at him like he'd rearranged the furniture of her entire world in the space of 10 seconds. "Are you okay?" He signed again, patient, waiting, not filling the silence the way hearing people always felt compelled to. She nodded, though it wasn't quite true. And for the first time that night, it didn't matter that it wasn't quite true, because someone had finally bothered to ask. He stayed a while longer that first night, sitting on the floor beside the piano bench rather than looming above her, his mop and bucket forgotten by the door. He didn't ask her a single question about her father, or her life, or what it was like to grow up in a house this size. He asked her, instead, what music felt like to her, whether the vibrations had colors or shapes in her mind, and she found herself answering at length, gesturing wildly, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually excited to explain something about herself to another person. He watched her hands the entire time with the kind of attention most people in her life reserve for their phones. When he finally had to go, he pressed both hands together and then opened them outward, a small sign she didn't recognize. She asked him what it meant. He told her it was something he'd made up for Lily years ago, a private sign between the two of them that meant simply, "See you tomorrow." He offered it to her too, easily, without ceremony, as though friendship were the simplest thing in the world to extend to another person rather than the rarest. Over the following weeks, Chloe found reasons to be near the music room whenever Arthur's night shift began. She would slip away from tutors, from therapists, from the rotating cast of assistants her father hired to manage her like a delicate asset that required constant appraisal, and she would find Arthur restocking supply closets or mopping the East Corridor. And they would talk, hands moving fast and easy, in the only language that had ever felt entirely hers. He told her, in fits and starts across several nights, why he knew sign language at all. His daughter, Lily, 7 years old and hard of hearing since a childhood illness had taken most of it from her, had needed it, so he learned it one exhausted night class at a time, squeezed between his day job and his night job, because that was simply what a father did for his kid. He didn't say it like it was remarkable. He said it like it was the only obvious choice a person could make. Chloe told him things she'd never said aloud to anyone, mostly because there had never been anyone patient enough to receive them. That she felt, most days, like a piece of furniture in her own home, dusted and admired and never once consulted. That her father loved her the way a man loves a fragile heirloom passed down through generations, terrified of it breaking, never once asking whether the heirloom might actually want to be used instead of displayed behind glass. That she was tired, so tired, of being protected out of a life instead of being allowed to live one. Arthur listened without flinching. He didn't pity her, didn't soften his opinions the way people did when they thought she was breakable. He argued with her sometimes, gently but honestly, the way an equal argues with an equal, telling her she was being too hard on herself one night and too easy on her father the next. And it was, to Chloe, an entirely new and exquisite feeling to be disagreed with instead of managed. She asked him once, hands moving slowly because the question mattered to her, whether he ever resented Lily's deafness, whether some part of him had wished, in the exhausted middle of the night, for a daughter who didn't require night classes and specialists and constant translation between two different worlds. Arthur thought about it honestly before he answered, which she appreciated more than a quick denial would have earned from him. He told her he had resented the exhaustion sometimes, the 2 jobs, the thin walls, the fear of never having enough. But he had never once, not for a single second, resented Lily herself, because Lily wasn't a problem to be managed. She was just his daughter, and you didn't resent the people you love for the shape their needs happen to take. You just met them. Chloe sat with that for a long time after he signed it, turning the idea over like a stone in her palm, because it was the exact opposite of everything her own father had ever shown her about what love was supposed to look like. Arthur asked her questions too, ones nobody in her gilded world had ever bothered to ask. What she would study if she could choose freely instead of following the curriculum her father's consultants had designed. Whether she'd ever been on a plane without 6 security personnel seated around her. What she actually wanted her life to look like 10 years from now, stripped of everyone else's expectations. She found she didn't have ready answers for most of them, and that unsettled her far more than any insult from the women in emerald gowns ever had, because it meant she had spent 23 years being protected from the world instead of building a life inside it. One evening, at her insistence, he brought her home with him after his shift, just for an hour, just so she could see. His apartment was small, the paint peeling near the ceiling in one corner, a folding table doing the work of a proper dining set that had never quite made it into the budget. And it was, in every way that actually mattered, warmer than the mansion she had grown up in. Lily came barreling out of her room the moment she spotted a stranger, all energy and curiosity in socked feet. Signing so fast Chloe could barely keep pace, delighted beyond measure to have found someone new who spoke her language fluently. They played a card game sprawled on the living room floor, Lily cheating outrageously and announcing her cheating with great pride the moment she was caught. Arthur made grilled cheese sandwiches that filled the small apartment with a smell Chloe realized, with a small private shock, she had never once smelled inside her own home. Laughter bounced off the thin walls in a way that felt almost solid, something she could catch with her hands if she reached for it. Nobody here treated her like she might shatter if handled incorrectly. Driving back to the estate, or rather being driven back in the sleek car her father insisted she use, Chloe pressed her forehead against the window and watched the modest neighborhood give way, block by block, to gates and hedges and cameras mounted on posts, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that she had spent her entire life living inside a beautiful tomb. Marcus, meanwhile, had begun to notice a change in his daughter that he did not care for. She held her chin higher at dinner. She questioned decisions she used to accept without comment. To most fathers, this might have looked like healthy, overdue growth. To Marcus, control-obsessed and quietly terrified of a world that had never once given him anything without a fight, it looked like a threat that needed to be managed before it grew any larger. He called her into his office one afternoon, the same office where he closed deals worth more than small nations, and laid out, with the same crisp confidence he used on his board, his plan for her future. A trust structured so carefully that she would never make a major decision again without approval from men she'd never met. A vetted partnership, his word for an arranged marriage, with the son of a business associate who could, in Marcus's own words, take care of her the way she required. Chloe stared at him across the wide desk, and for the first time in years, she didn't cry. She simply asked him, in the sign language he had never bothered to learn fluently despite having a deaf daughter for 23 years, whether he had ever once, in her entire life, asked her what she actually wanted. He squinted at her hands, understanding perhaps one word in 5, and had to ask her to repeat herself slower. That, in itself, was the answer, delivered without him even meaning to give it. She left his office shaking, humiliated and furious in equal measure, and there was only one place left to go. She went to find Arthur. They sat together in the music room that night, her hands moving fast and sharp and grieving, his moving slow and steady in response, grounding her the way an anchor holds a boat steady in rough water. He didn't offer solutions, because he didn't have any. He offered presence instead, which turned out to be the thing she actually needed. At one point she signed to him that she was tired of being someone's asset, tired of being spoken about instead of spoken to, tired of a life designed entirely around the assumption that she could not be trusted with her own decisions. Arthur reminded her, gently, that she had already proven that assumption wrong every single time she walked down to that music room instead of waiting quietly in her room for someone to rescue her. He told her that courage rarely looked dramatic from the inside. Most of the time it looked exactly like this: 2 people sitting on a floor, refusing to accept the story someone else had written for them. Marcus found them there, drawn by a passing assistant's careless mention of the music room's lights being on again. He saw his daughter's hand resting on a janitor's forearm, saw the closeness between them, the ease, and something ugly and frightened lit up behind his eyes all at once. He didn't see two people who had built something real out of nothing but patience and honesty. He saw a threat to the empire he'd built and the daughter he'd spent a fortune trying to lock safely inside its walls. He fired Arthur on the spot, his voice climbing to a volume Chloe could feel through the floorboards before she could even fully read his lips. He told Arthur that if he ever came near his daughter again, in any capacity, he would make certain Arthur never worked in this city, or this state, or possibly this industry, again in his life. Security escorted Arthur out through the service entrance that same night while Chloe screamed at her father in a furious, broken mixture of sign language and actual spoken words that he refused, even now, to try to understand. Arthur walked home in the cold because he no longer trusted himself behind the wheel, arriving to find Lily already asleep, and he sat at the folding kitchen table for a long time afterward, doing the quiet arithmetic of rent and groceries and a missing paycheck, wondering how he would explain any of this to a 7-year-old who had grown fond of a friend she would probably never see again. Chloe was confined to her wing of the house under the watch of 2 new security guards stationed outside her door. Her phone confiscated, her world shrunk back down to the size of a gilded box she had only just begun to imagine escaping. She spent the first night pacing the length of her room, replaying the look on her father's face when he'd seen her hand resting on Arthur's arm, the sheer speed with which he'd decided, without asking her a single question, that something shameful had occurred. It wasn't shame. It had never been shame. It was the first honest friendship of her adult life, and he had crushed it in under a minute because it didn't fit the story he had already written about who she was allowed to be. She thought, too, about Arthur, about Lily's small hands signing across a card game, about the folding table and the peeling paint and the grilled cheese sandwiches, and about how much more that apartment had felt like a home than the mansion she was currently locked inside of. She wondered if Arthur had told Lily yet why their new friend had disappeared. She wondered if Lily would think it was her fault somehow, the way children sometimes absorb blame that never belonged to them in the first place. For 3 days, she said almost nothing to anyone. Then something in her hardened into resolve instead of grief, the way water left out in freezing weather eventually stops being liquid and becomes something with edges. On the 4th day, her father was holding a board meeting downstairs. Investors and lawyers gathered around the long glass table to formally discuss the very trust meant to seal her future without a single word of her input. Chloe walked past the 2 guards stationed outside her door before either of them fully registered that she'd moved at all, her bare feet silent on the runner carpet, and she walked, calm and entirely unhurried, straight into the boardroom. Every head at the table turned. Marcus rose from his chair, furious and visibly mortified in front of the men whose respect he valued more than almost anything else in his life, already reaching for the smooth words that usually fixed everything. Chloe didn't wait for him to find them. She began signing, sharp and precise, each movement deliberate, and then, because she wanted every single person in that room to understand her without needing an interpreter to soften it for them, she began to speak aloud as well, her voice rough and unpracticed from years of disuse, but unmistakably, powerfully clear. She told her father, in front of the investors he had spent decades cultivating, that he had spent 23 years mistaking control for love and never once noticed the difference. That he had taken a good man's job and threatened his family for the crime of treating her like an actual human being instead of a liability on a balance sheet. That she was finished being managed like an asset, finished being protected out of every meaningful decision in her own life. Then she turned and walked out, past the guards who no longer seemed to know whether they were still allowed to stop her, out through the front doors of the estate that had never once, not for a single day, felt like home to her. Marcus sat back down at the head of that table in a silence he had never once experienced in his career, the silence of a man realizing, all at once and far too late, that money had bought him absolutely everything except the one thing he had actually wanted. Over the following days, he didn't call his lawyers. He didn't call security. He hired a private investigator, quietly, and asked for exactly one thing: the truth about the man he had fired and threatened without a second thought. What came back surprised him more than he expected. A single father working two exhausting jobs to keep his daughter fed, clothed, and safe. A man who had taught himself an entire language over years of night classes purely out of love rather than obligation. A man with more integrity in his ordinary, unglamorous daily life than Marcus had managed to accumulate across a career built on leverage, pressure, and fear. He found himself, a week later, standing outside a modest apartment building he would never once have set foot near before, in a neighborhood his usual security detail clearly found beneath their attention. He climbed the narrow stairs alone, without an entourage for perhaps the first time in a decade, and knocked. Arthur opened the door, already knowing, from the doorman downstairs, exactly who had come to see him. He didn't invite Marcus in right away. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, Lily's cartoons murmuring faintly from the television behind him, and waited. Marcus, for what may have been the first time in decades, did not lead with an offer or a negotiation. He led with an apology, plain and unpolished and entirely unlike him, admitting that he had let fear disguise itself as love for so long that he had nearly lost the only family he had left in the world. He admitted that his daughter had chosen, entirely on her own, someone who treated her like a whole person instead of a liability requiring management, and that he owed that person considerably more than a paycheck and an apology could ever cover. He offered Arthur a real position at the head of a new foundation he wanted to build and fund personally, one focused entirely on accessibility and support for the deaf and hard-of-hearing community. And he made clear, awkwardly but sincerely, that Arthur would set every term of the arrangement himself. Arthur listened, weighed the offer carefully against his own hard-earned wariness, and eventually agreed, on his terms and no one else's. He made clear that he wouldn't be anyone's charity case or apology trophy, that the work would need to be real, and that Lily's life would not be uprooted or paraded in front of cameras to make the sterling name look generous. Marcus agreed to every condition without argument, something none of his own board members would have believed possible had they witnessed it. Chloe found out about the visit only after it had already happened, when Arthur showed up at the modest apartment she'd taken in the city, the one she'd rented herself, with her own signature on the lease, the first document of her adult life that belonged entirely to her. She read the whole story off his hands, slower than usual, savoring each part of it, and when he finished she didn't quite know whether to laugh or cry, so she did a little of both. A year later, that foundation had a name, a staff, and a genuine mission, and Chloe ran it, not as a figurehead wheeled out for photographs, but as the person who had built its programs from the ground up, translating her own lonely, silence-filled years into something that might spare another child the same isolation she had lived through. Lily had grown an inch, lost a tooth, and gained a much bigger family without losing a single ounce of her spark. Arthur had traded one exhausting job for meaningful work that let him actually be home for dinner most nights of the week, sitting at a table that was no longer a folding one. And Marcus, slower than the others and far less graceful about it, was still learning one deliberate and often clumsy lesson at a time, how to actually listen to the daughter he had almost lost forever by trying too hard, in all the wrong ways, to keep her safe. He had started taking a weekly class of his own, 3 evenings after work, sitting among strangers half his age and twice as patient as he was, learning the shapes his daughter had been speaking to him in for 23 years while he simply hadn't bothered to learn the language. He was slow and clumsy and often had to ask the instructor to repeat herself, but he showed up every week, and Chloe, watching him fumble through a sentence at dinner one evening, thought that showing up might be the truest apology he had ever managed to give her. The chandeliers in that house still glittered every bit as brightly as they had on the night this story began. But the silence underneath them had changed completely. It was no longer the silence of isolation, the silence of a girl standing on the wrong side of the glass. It was the quiet, steady kind that comes only after 2 very different people, and eventually 2 very different families, finally take the time to understand each other. Somewhere below those chandeliers, on a night not so different from the one that started it all, A card game was underway on the living room floor of an apartment with fresh paint on the ceiling. Lily cheating outrageously, as always, and announcing it with pride. Chloe laughing in a voice she no longer felt any need to hide. And Arthur watching the two of them with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had simply chosen, once, to notice someone the rest of the world had decided to look past.